because you are beloved to Him, and He welcomes you to Himself. No matter who you are, no matter what you've done, welcome to church. If you're not a Christian, please come with us. Walk with us. This way of life that we are in, this journey in which we are engaged, this learning and discipleship with Jesus Christ, it's so rich, wonderful. It gives meaning and purpose to life. And so if you're not with Him, come with us. If you are a Christian, you're looking for a church home, or if you're just visiting, we want you to know how loved and welcome you are here, and we'd love to get to know you. If you are looking for a church home, welcome home. Come worship with us. Come back again. Be a part of our family, and let us be a part of yours. Because Jesus Christ calls us into love. Isn't it great to be here? This morning is the first day of a season called Advent. It is my favorite time of the year. If you've been with me for, this is my 7th Advent season here. And so if you've been with me, you know that I love preaching in December because I love the fact that the entire U.S. economy stops. Actually, it doesn't stop. It revs up because of this. And the entire culture has this moment where it becomes kind of okay, at least so far. I know that the culture around us is changing. I don't see Christmas going away anytime soon. Do you? This is my favorite time of year. I love the Christmas season. I love having a tree in my house that's covered with lights. It's weird. It's the only time of the year that you put a tree in your living room and you eat candy out of your socks. I love that. It's fantastic. It's the time of year for, being goodwill towards men and peace on earth and Black Friday shopping, I mean, look, don't you just see the goodwill in their facial expressions? I just love this time of year, though. It's the time when TBS goes like 24 hours, or maybe it's all month or something, I don't know, where it's constantly about Zuzu's pedals. And I loved, this movie was a flop when it was in the movie theater. It actually became this Christmas tradition because it was free, and TBS got it, and that's how it became a big Christmas tradition. I cannot imagine that being a flop. Jimmy Stewart is awesome in that movie. Hello, movie house. I love that. Or maybe you're more about not shooting your eye out. I know, isn't it great? It's just wonderful when the dog eats the spoiler. Sorry. Such a good, or maybe it's, for you, it's the Three Ghosts. I just this year realized that it's the most wonderful time. That there's that line that says, "in scary ghost stories," and I've always been like, what? That's 2 months ago. What are you even talking about? No, he's talking about this. Where the three ghosts of the different times of the guy's life come to terrify him into Christianity and shatter his materialism and his hatred for mankind and welcome him into this. I love this story. It's so gospel-shaped. And it just feeds into our living room and into our culture. It's the only time of the year that you ever drink that nasty stuff. That's on sale year-round at Ingles. It's next to the coffee creamer, but nobody buys it. Maybe they do. There are a lot of weirdnesses in humanity. But, this time of year, we get that out and put the nutmeg on it and pretend we like it, and we get together as family and gather around a meal that Jesus wouldn't have eaten because that's not kosher. So we celebrate the birth of a Jew by eating a ham. Someone explain that to me, but it's so much fun and it's relaxing. Somehow the world can slow down, at least for a day. And we just gather together with people that we love and love them. It's the only time of the year you can go up to a stranger's house in the middle of the evening, knock on their door, and sing a song at them, and they won't shoot at you. I love this time of year, and of course we do all of this because something amazing happened. Something amazing happened. I know, and folks in Churches of Christ know, if you don't know this, you're about to learn something, but we don't know when this happened. We don't know whether it's December 25th or not. No idea. Maybe. You know, there's a 1 in 365 chance, I suppose. It's not even the first date that was ever chosen by the church to focus on and celebrate. In the early 2nd century, I believe January the 5th was kind of the first time they were like, we need to remember this annually. And it migrated to this time period. I don't care. I really don't. The whole world stops. And it becomes possible to talk about the fact that God invaded the earth. God became one of us. And not one of the great ones, but a humble and small one in a broken royal family. They were to be kings and queens. And he was a carpenter and a nobody. And that's how God comes to earth. It's this amazing story. It is the beginning of the story of our salvation. And folks, I will not let it pass by. I just can't. I know that I grew up in a church where you could sing, "O Come All Ye Faithful" in August. You weren't really allowed to do it after Thanksgiving, because you didn't want any confusion. I don't think any of us are confused. And I just think we need to settle ourselves into the wonder of the great grace and gift of God in our Lord Jesus Christ and His wondrous birth as God, the Almighty, becomes infant, as the All-Powerful becomes weak and dependent, comes to rescue sinners like me. When the story begins, it begins in a very interesting place. Just where is He coming, this one who comes among us? The story begins in despair and reproach. In a place where the people that the story comes to are not people whose lives are going great and smoothly and well, but whose lives are wounded, broken, and hurting, and really beyond hope. That's where the story begins, and of course, people who are there find their way very easily here, don't they? Because the story also begins in a place of great fear. Spoilers. Let me go ahead and get into it. The story begins with a guy named Zechariah, a guy who will play a bit part at the beginning of the gospel, but who casts a very large theological shadow, I think, over the entire story. He comes as an echo to a much earlier figure that really was the beginning of all salvation and redemption and everything that God had done. Really good and wonderful man, Zechariah. In the days of Herod, king of Judah, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. And he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. They were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. That blameless walk doesn't imply that he was sinless. Doesn't mean that. But it does mean you've got a good and noble man here. A person who is intentionally trying to find his way into the will of God, seeking out the will of God. We know from later in the story that that woman of the tribe of Aaron, that she's married into the royal family of David, because this is a cousin to our hero. This one who will be born is born cousin, same family line. So we're talking about David's family here. And this priest is a good man, a noble man. But, and this is a pretty big, conjunction, but the disjunction. That we've started with such a good man, but they had no child because Elizabeth was barren, and both were advanced in years. Now that's a sad story no matter what culture you live in. If you've ever struggled with infertility, I'm very sorry. Ashley and I are somewhat familiar with that pain. Having children in this cursed earth is not always easy. And it can be dreadfully awful. You can lose children before they're born. You can never have them. This is a story of woe in any culture in the world, but most especially in theirs. We think of infertility as a kind of a medical problem, a kind of medical crisis, and a terrible sorrow. But it has to do with your body. In the ancient world, that just wasn't true. The rubric that they would place over this is the rubric of curse. They would think of it as a spiritual problem. Something that meant that you were not in God's favor. And remember, this is a good man, a noble man. But he has no kids, so no one around him is going to see him that way. Not only that, but the common belief in the ancient world was that you continued to exist in part by continuing your family line. That individualism that we cherish so much in our culture, that you were primarily, whatever your first name is, I'm Ethan. They didn't think that way. They thought of themselves as the latest log thrown onto the fire, and their real identity is the fire, not the log. So my identity then would be Brown. And you ask, which one? Well, the log is Ethan, but my identity is Brown. So this guy and his wife, they would have thought of themselves as the death of something that has been burning for centuries. They're the dead end. That they're the cursed ones. They're the hopeless ones. It is absolutely essential that we realize that the beginning of God's work is with cursed people. People who experience despair. People who hurt. Who feel like their lives are a long lost tunnel and maybe there's a light and maybe it's an oncoming train or maybe it's a light, but if I move that way, I'll set off the collapse. There are people in this room today that I know of who are facing that kind of crisis in life. I know you've talked to me. I know how bad you're hurting. And it's so very easy in this world to step into despair. And I think it's essential that we realize that this is where God begins. God always starts here. In fact, remember how the great story of redemption gets its beginning? This couple isn't the first barren couple God started with. It was a man in his 70s that God called to leave his father and say, go to the place where I will show you. They were very, very, very old indeed, 100 and 101 before the promised children arrived. It's almost like God is giving us a message here to the despairing and to the hopeless and to the broken. You're my start place. I intend to work in you. Do not think that you are hopeless and beyond help, because you are not. No one is so far gone that they are beyond the reach of God. But it does not make our time in the tunnel easy, does it? So, this priest, still living out his good life, doing the very best that he can, he says, now while he was serving as priest before God, when his division was on duty, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And now, this is an amazing gift he's got here. Off he goes into the temple. This is a daily task. But I don't know how many times a priest would get to do this in their lifetime. Priests may rotate in from far away to come and get to do this. And so here he is, serving in the temple, and there's this big group of people, and off he goes into the place where you're not allowed to go. Behind the door that is always shut. Into the presence, the mystery, and the wonder of God. But it's important, I think, to realize that he does not go there intact. This guy did not clean up his despairing life when he walked in, and people didn't start thinking well of him before he goes in there. He goes in broken. Because you're called where you are, not where you ought to be. You're called from the place of despair and brokenness and called into God's presence. And he is very specifically chosen. It says he was chosen by lot. But, I mean, you got to know, there's someone who's got their thumb on the scale here, right? He's been chosen and called by God. I think it's important for us to realize that God did not have to do this. He didn't have to work with this guy, and he didn't have to do it this day. He could have waited until another guy was going in. He could have chosen anybody. He chose the despairing. That's got to say something to us. The beginning of the gospel says, you are not too far gone. The whole crowd is outside. The whole multitude of people were praying outside at the hour of incense. And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. Zechariah was troubled when he saw him. Fear fell upon him. I suspect that's something of an understatement, don't you? Can you imagine coming to church today and standing next to this table right here is someone who's like 9 feet tall with wings? And who knows what the guy looks like, you know? Maybe he's got fur all over his face or something. Every time people see angels, they are terrified. Every time. So whatever they look like, it's kind of spooky. You know? I suspect, and fear fell upon him. You know, if he had been writing it, he would have said, you know, but next to the altar was standing an angel, and you know. But it actually is a response that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Does it ever feel like you were just very unprotected in a harsh world? We actually, socioeconomically, most of us in this church don't know everything about just how harsh it can be. And yet we feel it. There are times when things are just unfair, where we feel the betrayal, we feel the sin, we feel the curse of the broken world. Maybe it falls on you in your health or some relationship that goes entirely sideways that you didn't see coming. Sometimes it just seems like there's nobody out there rooting for us. It's not surprising to feel afraid when you live in this cursed world, even when God shows up. In fact, I would suggest that if God showed up and you were absolutely certain it was God, it might be the most terrifying of all. And especially if you were living with any sort of despair. Because the truth is, maybe I'm lonely. Maybe I should just speak for myself. But sometimes in my life it feels like God doesn't care. Sometimes it feels like He's willing to let all kinds of trouble land on me that I think He probably should have done something about. Now, I'm wrong, because He didn't exercise His power and He didn't do it. And how many times has He been wrong? Yeah, never. That doesn't change despair. That knowledge and getting it into my heart doesn't necessarily do it. It's why He tells us a story. And it's why we're led into this man at the very beginning of the story, so that I can carry my despair and I can sit down beside him and I can feel the fear together with him. When the confrontation comes and the wonder and the fright and thinking, are you really for me? Am I going to be okay? Because that happened, that happened, that happened, that happened. Where have you been, huh? And we're here now. What are we going to do? Because are you here to kill me? Is it going to be all right? Am I all right with you, God? Have I let you down so much that you don't even want me anymore? Am I lonely? The gospel begins here with that man, filled with his despair and fear. And here comes the gospel. But the angel said to him, do not be afraid, Zechariah. So often he must tell us, God must tell us, do not be afraid. It's repeated over and over and over in both Testaments. Do not be afraid. It's almost as if one of our biggest problems is fear. Fear that God is mad at us. Fear that God is not for us. Fear that we've blown it so badly that He can't do anything with us. Fear that it can't be made right. Fear that I've screwed everything up and maybe the best that I can do is hide and pretend it's not there. Don't be afraid. And just like Adam and Eve, our race has been hiding in shadows the entire time. And He's calling to those who hide in shadows, don't be afraid, for your prayers have been heard. And how many times have you been where you talk to the ceiling and thought, there's nobody listening to me at all. When it feels like our prayers get no higher than the hair of our head, and they just, nothing. Don't you know he felt that? Throughout the years of possible childbearing, and as they drew to a close, don't you know he thought, no one is listening to me. It's those very prayers that the gospel begins with. Your prayers have been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John. We learn later that John is not a family name. It's not something, this is a name given by the angel, given by God. Do you know what the name John means? God is gracious. That's what the name means. The gospel begins with this pronouncement. You will call the forerunner the grace of God. Because the grace of God is coming. The grace of God is invading. It is breaking into the world to be good to those who think they are beyond His grace. And you will have joy and gladness. And don't you know that he thought that that is just a pipe dream? I suspect there's part of him saying, don't tell me that. Don't tell me that. I have lived too long in my sorrow. The gospel comes and says, you will have joy and gladness. And not just you, but many will rejoice in his birth, for he will be great before the Lord. Now look at what And he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord, and he will go before them in the power of Elijah, and turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, and to make ready for the Lord a people prepared. He says, this kid you're going to have is coming to break in and shake up everything. Because everything is about to change. What God is about to do is going to be so powerful and so wonderful that love is going to break out everywhere it touches. He's going to make everyone ready to receive the power to love one another. And your kid's going to do that. Now I'm going to move on. Listen to what his heart says in response to that. You hear that. What would you say in response to the idea that God is about to move to flip everything over? Yep. Well, yeah, that's what he says. I would say, you would think you'd say, yippee, but he doesn't. He says, it's too late. That's not believable. That can't be done. That's impossible. Don't you know where I am in my life? Don't you know what's happened to me? Don't you see what's going on? How can I possibly believe something that good is for me? For me. And really, look at me. Do I deserve that? So he says, Zechariah said to the angel, how should I know this? For I'm an old man and my wife is advanced in years. It can't be done. Now listen, what's his job again? Well, that's right, he's a priest. Priests tend to be kind of religious people. Sort of, And what's his story? Has he never heard of Abraham? But see, it's really easy for it all to stay a story over there, and my life is over here, isn't it? When the contrast, even when the story lines up perfectly. Yeah, but God did that then. I'm me. I don't deserve that. How can I know? And what do you do with a heart that's loaded up with despair when it says that kind of thing to yourself and when it says that kind of thing to God? Because have you ever done it? Again, am I lonely? Am I the only one whose prayers ever sound like that? How can I believe that God will be good to me? Why should I believe it? How do I keep moving when I live in a world of trouble and I live a life of trouble and there's pain here? How do I believe you, God? I want to believe you. How do I do it? Well, the answer is, shut up. This is the angel answered him, I am Gabriel, and I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and to bring you this good news. I think he said it like that, by the way. I mean, can't you just hear the incredulity? Do you know who you're with? Did you really just doubt me? Because I am the chief angel. I'm the head of the whole thing. And I stand with God. How often have you been there? I've been there. I've seen him face to face. And he's the one who commissioned this thing. Really? Really, Zach? You have been doing this for how long? Come on. Behold, you will be silent and unable to speak until the day that these things take place, because you do not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time. Man, if he was scared before. But there's the answer to despair. There is a time, and folks, I can't do it to myself. Maybe you can. Perhaps you have the spiritual strength when your despairing heart stands up and says, because it's a horse. No, it groans and it says it's all bad and nothing will be okay. And when that's happening inside me, if I call on my power, I harmonize. You know, I'm like, yeah, that's right. Oh. That's what I do. That's not what the gospel does. The gospel stands before that groaning misery and says, be silent. Be silent, don't you know my God? Don't you know who he is? He is God of cross and empty tomb. He is God of the barren womb made full. He is God of both of those. And so if it's hard, that's okay, because God is good and will be good in his time. And I will not groan when all I feel is the curse and the trouble of the world, because I know the gospel. And the gospel tells me the truth about my God, and I will believe the gospel. And so you, faithless heart, be silent. Be still within me and hear the truth of God. And meditate on the wonder of the goodness of God. Be still. Be still. And so he is. And when the people were waiting and they were wondering what his delay was in the temple, I bet they're kind of embarrassed. You know, like, what's he doing in there? He only had to light a few candles, you know. I mean, come on. Would he get lost? You know, I don't think there's a bathroom in there. What is he doing? You know, he didn't have a book with him. What's going on? So they're wondering, what's the delay? And when he comes out, he was unable to speak to them, and they realized that he'd seen a vision in the temple. He kept making signs to them, but he remained mute. He said, there's this message here. He goes home, mute. When his service is over, he goes home, quiet, unable to speak to the wife he's grown to cherish and love through that long years of arranged marriage. He loves Elizabeth, but he can't talk to her. He's had amazing news, and he can't share it with her. I mean, how do you suppose he even wooed her? He can't even talk to her because he can't say anything. There's a huge message in this to the despairing heart. Be still and know that I am God, says the Lord your God. Stop the murmuring. Sit in God's presence. Let the gospel work upon our hearts to give us hope in the hopeless days. Be the light in the darkness. Let God shine into the most broken of life, because he can and does. That's who your God is. How do I know? Because of what happened to Elizabeth. After these days, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she kept herself hidden, saying, thus, the Lord has done for me in the days when he has looked upon me to take away my reproach among the people. All of her long life, all those years when childbearing was supposed to be happening to her, throughout her 20s and 30s and 40s and into her 50s, she had borne the reproach of the accusation of her culture. Useless, worthless, evil, unwanted, unblessed. Here comes God to bless this woman, to let everyone everywhere know You are not beyond His ability to bless, and He can take away your reproach. He does not hold you in reproach. And if God does not, who cares what they say? Walk with God and be alive in the gospel. Do not let the despair of the broken world overcome you. This is how the gospel begins. So, just a few quick lessons and we're done. First of all, being faithful and righteous doesn't mean pretending that everything is okay when life gets hard. And I think that's a huge, important message that we must hear at the beginning of the gospel. The gospel is not a song sung by Shirley Temple. We are not on the good ship Lollipop. We are on the cursed earth. There is darkness and pain here, and we don't have to pretend differently. And when you hurt and when you're sad, you don't have to say, that's not there. A fool says that. You won't live faithfully in the midst of your pain if you deny it. The gospel doesn't. It begins with this negative, sad, broken, awful story. And it intends to flip it over. I think it's very important to be able to recognize despair and what does it say to me. Okay? Because this is very important. Despair says, how can I trust God in light of the events of my life? Okay, that's what despair will do to you. That's why it needs to shut up. Because what it's doing is saying, God's not trustworthy. God's not good. God's not able. And that must become mute and silent within us. It has to be quieted. And that doesn't mean I don't have to deal with the events of my life. I just can't do it through despair. Because the faithful prism says, how do I understand the events of my life? In light of my trust in God. Zechariah, though he was still a faithful priest and going through all of the motions, even serving in the temple for goodness sakes, his question reveals the place of his heart. He was looking at his world and saying, how can God possibly be good to me? Instead of, how do I get a nursery ready? My back hurts. Which should have been his question. So the faithful heart doesn't deny the problem. It says, God, what are you going to do with me? I am your servant. I rest in your care. Do what you will. I'll face this truth, no matter how unpleasant it is, because you're with me. I'm going to go through this, and I'm going to do it well. And fear and despair become silent by the power of the gospel. It doesn't become silent by self-will. And it doesn't become silent by pretense that it's not there. And it doesn't become silent just because I want it to. It becomes silent as the gospel works on our hearts. It is not Zechariah who chose to be quiet. It was at the word of the angel that the despair became silent. And so it is with us. We become more faithful as the gospel impacts us and causes this grumbling sorrow to still. It's how it happens, by the work of God in us. And God, for us, we stand in a different place from Zechariah. We get to look back at his story. He didn't. You know, he's living through it. But you don't get to look forward in your story either. So how do I trust? When I'm in this place of pain and darkness and sorrow and uncertainty, how do I trust? This is how. I know who my God is. God has already moved to encourage us in our despair and to take away our reproach. As I enter into the gospel story with my life and let it become my story, then I define everything that's going on around me in light of the God I find there. The God who sends His Son to rescue and save. The God who dies together with me in my brokenness and raises up to take me together with Him. This is how I face the trouble of my life, and He's already done it all. And so as I settle my heart into Him, I don't have to lie about what I'm going through. I just have to tell the truth about God. Because I live with this promise. The gospel promises that God will move again. And that one day, all despair and all fear will be forever done. Good news, church. Gospel. This God has accomplished for you, and this God promises you. So no matter what we walk through, No matter what happens in this life, we are people who cherish a hope that cannot be taken from us because it isn't held by our hands, it's held by God's. And God holds us in hope. As we let the gospel work upon us, God works within us and He conquers despair for us. We need only to trust. This is good news. This is what God has accomplished in the invasion of the earth. How are you with this? Some of you really aren't in despair right now. If that's you, good. Pray for those who are because they sit with you right now. There are some who do. So if it's not you, fine. Pray for the hurting. But if it is you, how are you doing? As you look into your heart and you feel the pain and the sorrow, and are you well with God? Because God is well with you and wants you for Himself. And if you need the prayers of the people of God this day, we want to give them to you. It may be that you came into this place today and you carried a load of pain, and I haven't touched on it at all. That's fine. Let us know what it is. We want desperately to pray for you. And if you're not a Christian, there's no better day than to begin following Jesus Christ than this day. If you're subject this morning to the invitation of God, why don't you come right now while we stand and sing?